Should you read Dune? With the Dune Part 1 movie being a huge success and Dune Part 2 coming out this year, a lot of people are considering reading Dune the book for the first time. I've spoken to so many people that have considered reading Dune for the first time or have read it after watching the films. Almost all of them have expressed trepidation about reading the book for one or more reasons. That is fair. In a lot of ways, Dune is an intimidating book, but it is my favorite book. I know a lot about it, and so today I'm going to explain to you whether or not you should read it. I'm going to delve into different aspects of the book. We're going to keep it spoiler-free. I'll go over some bigger meta-level things about it, but I'm not going to tell you specific details or plot spoilers. The first question I have for you about the discussion of whether or not you should read Dune is, are you afraid of commitment? Dune is a book that at least requires commitment to enjoy it and finish it. Now, the biggest complaint that I see from people reading Dune for the first time or considering it is that it's a very long, big book. I think that the current published editions give a bad idea of this because this looks huge, right? This looks pretty massive. However, I own multiple editions of Dune that literally fit in the back pocket of my jeans. This is just big because it's exciting and they're releasing the movies and they want to make big, exciting special editions of the book. In actuality, it's not really that long. This edition specifically comes in right around the 650 page mark. For some people, that might be a lot longer than what they usually read, depending on what their genre is. But for science fiction and fantasy, that's pretty average. This is literally half as long as the book I'm reading now, which is Oathbringer. So I think it's a very healthy length, especially given the scale and scope of what this book tackles. That, I think, is the true intimidation factor with Dune. It's not the length, it's not how big the book is, it's the depth. When you're reading Dune, you're not just reading a story, you're being presented with an entire world with tens of thousands of years of human history and more planets beyond just the world that you're discussing. That brings us to our first major point of discussion, which is the structure of the book. Act 1, the beginning of the book, everything you read at the start is pretty much all world building. It's all set up for the rest of the book. The depth of Dune is contained in those first couple hundred pages. Of course, it keeps going, it gets expanded upon, but you are jumping right into the deep end with this book. That's not something that is uncommon in science fiction and fantasy. If you've read a lot of sci-fi or fantasy, you've definitely read a lot of books where they start with words that sound like total gibberish. There's 1,000 new names, 1,000 new places, different magic systems, different science systems. It's a lot to keep in your head at one time. If you're not experienced with that, Dune can be very, very difficult to understand at the beginning. That is no fault of your intelligence, that is no fault of your reading ability, that is because it's just a big sci-fi book. I personally am someone who loves world building, so when I got into that, I was like, this is amazing, I can't get enough of this. Give me all the details about geopolitics and planetary politics and every piece of history about the entire universe. I love that stuff. If you don't love that stuff, if you really don't like world building, this book might not be worth it for you. There is action, there is payoff, but a lot of the beauty and appeal of the book is in the extraordinary world that it has created. Frank Herbert, the author, truly created a tangible world. It feels like it actually functions, the logic systems all make sense. And for me, that is actually my favorite part of this entire book, is how extraordinarily deep and real the world feels. That makes the story, the characters all way more believable and way more enjoyable, in my opinion. Even if you don't know if you like world building, if you're open to that experience, I would say stick with it past that first part of the structure, because that makes it so much of a better, deeper, more real book than almost any other book I've ever read. Of course, there are a number of series and books that do a great job of the same thing, but Dune is a particularly great example. Like I said before, there is action in this. It tends to pick up as the book goes along, so you're not going to get a ton of it right away. Even though there is some, there's a lot of build-up at the first part of the book. Granted, that build-up is very exciting beyond just the world building. There's incredible political maneuvering, there's a lot of characterization that goes on. There's a lot to love in the first part of Dune. However, it just takes a minute to get into, so I would encourage you to bear with it if you're open to that experience. Once it does pick up, it doesn't stop. It's wildly exciting, so it's fun to get to that as well. I mentioned that the amazing world building feeds into the characterization super well, so let's discuss that next. Paul, the main character, is one of my favorite characters in all of fiction. He's fascinating, he's very unique. I love to watch his journey, the changes he experiences, and those are even continued in the Dune sequels. So if you like his character, there's a lot more to him you can learn. That being said, a key part of this book is that he is not the hero. He's not a hero. This book is free from any true heroes. And when I say true hero, I mean like He-Man, like someone who's just so goody two-shoes that they're almost two-dimensional. Paul is a very morally gray character. All of the characters in Dune are. I think that's what makes them feel so real. They are inherently flawed, and by no means could you say that all of their actions are morally good. I do think that Paul does his best with what he's got, but that still doesn't mean that he's a good person. It doesn't mean he's morally amazing. He is the protagonist. He is worth reading about. He's fascinating. I learned a lot from his journey. But if you're expecting a paragon of righteousness, you're not going to get that here. The fact that all these characters exist in that moral gray area is intentional in my opinion. I think it adds a lot to the themes and ideas presented in the book. If you don't enjoy morally gray characters in any regard, then I would say maybe this isn't for you. Of course, there are a ton of other characters in this book. I think that they're all pretty incredible. Some of my favorites are Chani, Stilgar, Duncan Idaho, Jessica, someone I'm not going to say because I don't want to spoil their presence necessarily, Gurney, Duke Leto, and of course, Beast Raban. Baron Harkonnen is also excellent. I think he's an amazing villain. The Harkonnens in general are framed as villains from the beginning of the story. They are kind of classic villains, but their motivations do make sense when you're analyzing the way that people with wealth and power at extreme levels operate in the world. The one knock against this, I will say, is that Frank Herbert didn't do a great job at writing women. This book passes the Bechdel test, like barely. Very, very barely. I think it's one conversation that gets it like across the Bechdel test threshold, but that's a very low bar. I don't want to say too much more about that because I don't want to give any spoilers, but the women in this book are definitely not paid as much attention to as the male characters are by the author. The actual writing of Dune, the prose, is one of the highlights to me. I think the content of the book, because of its religious themes, its exploration of mythology, and the incredible political maneuvering, the story of it reads like somewhere between scripture and Shakespeare. The prose itself mirrors that in a lot of different ways. The writing style, when compared to modern books, feels a little bit formal, but I think compared to old sci-fi that I've read, it actually feels pretty conversational. It can be dense at times, that much is certainly true, but it's not overly dense. Like, I'm starting to read the Book of the New Sun. That is like dense on the level of tungsten, of like the hardest, is that the hardest material? No, diamond's the hardest material. Tungsten has the highest melting point, I believe. That's dense. This, I would say, is dense like a good hardwood. Like, this could be oak. You know what I mean? It's not bad at all. It's very approachable. I think it's honestly about average for this era of science fiction in terms of how obtuse the prose is. And I love the writing style. I think it actually kind of gets into some poetic realms occasionally, depending on what's being described. When you have a world that's this rich and deep, and you understand it as well as the author did, because he had a very clear vision of what he was doing, all you really need to do is describe what you see in your head. And that is effectively what he did, and it turned out really well. Now, on to our last set of specific notes before we get to the overall takeaways and ideas about whether or not you should read Dune. Let's discuss the main themes of the book. This book is so rich in different themes. You could get into it for days, weeks. I wrote a massive essay on this at one point, like really delving into it. Suffice to say that it covers things like the environment, forgive me, I'm reading from a list because there's so much. The environment, human nature, colonialism, imperialism, religious fervor, destiny, the concept of family, and the survival of the human species. Really, really far-reaching, really big stuff, but also very focused things. All of that is discussed here, and there's some really interesting commentary on literally all of it. It's a big book. Going back to the depth again, there's a lot of depth of thematic exploration and ideas in this book. I do think the biggest themes are, one, religion and mythology. There's a lot to that theme in this book. I'm not going to say any spoilers about it, but it is a huge plot point, and Frank Herbert makes some points. If you don't want discussion of religion in a book, which I think is kind of hard to avoid, honestly, then you might want to avoid this. I think it is well done. I think it's nuanced. I think it's fascinating. But in some ways, Dune is a critique of religious fervor. I want you to be aware of that before you get into it. I love the environmental themes and the way that played into the story. I thought that was actually really beautiful because it also plays into the beauty of the planet itself. But this truly is a book of substance. And that brings me to the overall considerations for whether or not you should read this book. Dune is not an easy book. There is a lot of depth and richness and thematic significance. This is not the kind of thing you're going to pick up and read just for fun. You're going to have to actually think about it and really commit to the process of getting through it to get the most out of the book and finish it while enjoying it. I love a good, fun, casual read. Dune, to me, at this point, is that because I've read it before and I've read a lot of crazier books since then. But especially if this is your first foray into epic science fiction, into space operas, into the sort of high fantasy of the sci-fi genre, or into any of those genres in the first place, this is going to be a lot. I think that's a very good thing. I'm just saying that when you get into it, you kind of have to commit to the process of learning what that kind of world is, and getting used to the different names for things, getting used to the crazy world building, the fantastical elements. I wouldn't say it's an acquired taste necessarily by any means. It's not like very out there. It just takes some thought, and I think it's very much worth that thought. However, if you're not in the kind of space where you want to read something that is deep and takes a lot of intention and presentness when you're reading it, then maybe don't read it right now. The fact that I think Dune is an intentional book to read doesn't mean that it's hard to understand. I think that once you get over the initial hump of getting used to the different naming conventions and the big world building and the large cast of characters, it gets really fun and easy to get into further. A lot of that is going to be really different from real life. It is science fiction, and this is like high-level science fiction. This to me is just as strange to real life as Star Wars is. The difference being that Star Wars is very popularized and a lot of people talk about it. Imagine if you didn't know what the Force was, you had no clue what a lightsaber was, and you had to figure it out for the first time. That's like starting Dune. The only other major consideration is this is one of the most impactful books ever in the science fiction genre. Star Wars is inspired by it, Warhammer, pretty much everything after it pulls a little something from Dune. So I think it is highly worth reading if you're down to take on the challenge. It's not a huge challenge, but it does take a little bit of intention. Have you read Dune? Are you planning to? Let me know your thoughts, and as always, thank you for being here and happy reading.